Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Christopher von Rueden. He is Associate Professor of Leadership Studies at the University of Richmond, an anthropologist with expertise in traditional human societies. His research focuses on how humans form status hierarchies, why we evolved to do so, and the demographic and ecological factors that cause our hierarchies to be more or less coercive. Relatedly, he studies the role of leader-follower relationships in the evolution of human cooperation, and those are the topics we're going to talk about today. So, Dr. von Ruden, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Pleasure to be here. Yeah, I've enjoyed listening to your previous podcast, so it's fantastic to talk to you.
Oh, thank you so much for being a follower then.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with leadership then. How would you define leadership, or what would you say it is from an evolutionary perspective?
I think leadership is one of those terms that's been defined so many different ways. A very general definition might be differential influence over decision making, collective decision making, or collective behavior in a group. And so that differential influence, could represent, a single individual. It could represent sort of a gradient of influence across individuals within a group over the collective decision making or behavior. And that can play out in different domains of collective decision making or behavior. So establishment of goals, logistics of coordination, monitoring of effort of group members towards some goal, and then sanctioning, punishment and reward according to effort. All those things can involve differences across individuals in a group in terms of their influence over those processes. So that's maybe leadership generally. An evolutionary approach to leadership, I think, would ask why individuals would seek such influence in a group, and why others, importantly, because when you talk about leadership, you're implicitly talking about followership, why others would grant such influence to others. In essence, giving more decision-making power, or at least influence over decision-making, to others. So what would be, in evolutionary terms, the reproductive costs and benefits for pursuing leadership, or alternatively for pursuing followership? And follow-up sort of evolutionary approaches would ask, how do those costs and benefits, reproductive costs and benefits perhaps, depend on individual attributes like body size or knowledge or social relationships, and then also depend on the context, ecological, cultural, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So that'd be a general, framework for.
No, that's good enough to start with. And let me ask you then, since we're talking about an evolutionary perspective, do we know how far back in evolutionary history does leadership go? Are there other animals who also have leaders in their species, their groups? And if so, what would be the best animal models for us to compare ourselves?
I think leadership is fairly, ubiquitous in group living species. But I think so there's a lot that we can learn from animal models. And maybe I could, talk about my understanding of different animal examples of leadership in different animals. But I think one thing to point out might be that what's unique about human leadership is the extent to which leadership involves explicitly assigning tasks to individuals in the group, and then followers in that group all sharing sort of common intentions to pursue a goal. And I think that those things maybe aren't so prevalent elsewhere outside humans. I'd say perhaps the majority of leadership including in humans and non-humans, is more passive kinds of leadership, where there's no explicit coordination, and yet some individual or sets of individuals in a group do some action, some behavior that then triggers others to follow suit for purposes of coordination or something else. But there's no necessarily active explicit coordination on the part of leaders. So, for example, a common example in the sort of leadership literature is in ungulates, like or zebras. There's an example of the individuals that frequently will lead herds to new grazing areas are pregnant females because of their sort of energetic demands. They're sort of the first to sort of want to move to some new area to seek out more water or new graze, and they won't explicitly, signal to other members of the herd to follow them. But once that one individual starts moving in a new direction, the herd will move with them, just because everybody wants to coordinate to maintain that collective. Or lion hunting, where a group of female lions, one will make the initial sort of move towards a prey animal, and that will sort of spur the rest to do the same. Not that one lead animal is necessarily signaling to the others in an explicit way, oh, let's go this way. It's sort of that first mover is sort of like a coordination device for everybody else. Mm-hmm. So I think much of leadership is sort of like that. It's more passive. As opposed to in humans, we see so often this explicit assignment of tasks, and among followers, a sort of a sense of common interests, explicit sense of common interests in pursuing a goal. Now, that said, there are lots of other examples in animals of more explicit leadership, even if it's not sort of in the terms of some management of a complex division of labor. So elephants and orcas will attentively guide kin to new areas to pursue resources. We see like ant queens will punish workers who try to reproduce. In terms of conflicts, we see in other primates that dominant individuals will break up fights, disrupt fights, which some argues sort of serves a public good by maintaining sort of the social networks that individuals depend upon. So there's examples like that that show that leadership is fairly ubiquitous. Mm-hmm. That it does include examples of more active leadership in non-humans, but not to my knowledge anything like, and I hope to be corrected, some sort of complex management of a complex division of labor, where all group members have sort of common intentions about what they're doing.
But I mean, it's correct to say that leadership and leaders serve social functions, right? It's not that idea that some people have that leaders are just self-interested or self-serving and do not have sort of a more social role to play, and that even sometimes can have an active pro-social role, right?
Yeah, I mean, it can be a win-win. So leaders could be pursuing leadership for, remuneration of some sort, direct, or a greater cut off the collective good, or so the status benefits, reputational benefits of effective leadership, or because they're aiding kin, or leaders may not benefit individually, but as being a member of a group in which there is leadership and followership, all members might do better than other groups that lack leader-follower relationships. So I think you can point to leadership benefiting the individuals to pursue it. In other cases where it's not clear that leaders actually benefit. So it's not necessarily always pro-social in the evolutionary, or truly altruistic even in an evolutionary sense. But it could be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wasn't saying that's always the case, just referring to the fact that sometimes it can be, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. So, related to that, how do humans form hierarchies? And, I mean, is hierarchy something universal in human societies? Are even all small-scale societies hierarchical, at least to some extent, or not?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's good to contrast status, hierarchy, and leadership. And I think there's a lot of overlap there. Status hierarchy being like a sort of rank ordering of individuals according to who gets what, or who gets what resources in a group, and perhaps leadership is one of those coveted resources, or leadership is a means of accessing coveted resources. But yeah, so status hierarchy generally in terms of like individuals deferring to other individuals in terms of access to resources, be it food, mates, territory. Yeah, I think in human societies is ubiquitous, but it can be pretty subtle. So even in the most egalitarian human societies, like in any human group, I think some people have a little more influence than others. And some people listen to what other people say a little more than others. And some people are a little more favored as allies or as mates. And those, effects can be subtle, but they're there. So I think when we often talk about, a lot of my interest in work is with smaller scale, more egalitarian societies. And I've always been interested in what does egalitarianism really mean? And certainly there are these, we can talk more about, why humans are many human societies are egalitarian, but it doesn't mean an absence of hierarchy. And I think that's partly what you were asking. So in my view, hierarchy is ubiquitous. It can be more or less conspicuous. How steep it is, meaning how unequal resource divisions are, can vary. Yeah, I think it's ubiquitous, even in relatively egalitarian societies.
Yeah, and I mean, there's also, in every human society, I guess, there's always status differentials, right? I mean, it's not that everyone has exactly the same status, right?
Right, and I think, just because differences in all kinds of interindividual differences come to matter in how people interact with each other and how that affects who listens to who's preferred as a mate or an ally in any human group. I just think there are certain societies, though, where there's a lack of a lot of material resources, and there's also strong motivations for individuals to cooperate with each other and to express humility as a means of maintaining those cooperative relationships that can make sort of status distinctions very subtle, but nevertheless they can have effects. So, for example, I did a study with Adrian Yagi that looked at, among men, the relationship between status and reproductive outcomes. And we found even in our sample of human hunter-gatherers, including many very egalitarian ones, that there are these effects of informal status differences on men's reproduction. Now, they're not big effects, but they're there.
Yeah. But since you were talking about status hierarchies, are there other kinds? I mean, are there different kinds of hierarchies, and some of them might not be based on status, or how does it work?
There's this popular, I think, distinction now between dominance and prestige. You may have come across that, and I think it got especially popularized with Joe Henrich and Francisco Gil White have a model of prestige-based hierarchy and they contrast it with dominance-based hierarchy. And so, dominance-based hierarchy meaning access to contested resources according to individuals' relative ability to inflict costs on each other or coerce each other, right? And so a lot of the initial work on status hierarchy, especially on humans, is focusing on dominance and the way that animals negotiate contests with each other. And an influential model is the asymmetric war of attrition, where individuals will sort of fight up to a point where they assess, given their interest in the resource and given their assessment of their own or their opponent's fighting ability, they'll sort of back off and then defer to the victor. And that all is based on, coercive ability, right? And so certainly, I think non-human hierarchies, hierarchy is much more based on dominance. But there's been an increasing recognition that prestige and other kinds of leverage matter in the formation of hierarchies in non-humans. Prestige being an ability to benefit others. And so people might defer to you because you can benefit them and provide them benefits, not just coerce them. And so, so I think there's been increasing recognition in the animal literature that dominance and coercion is not the sole route to status, and of course that depends on the species and the ecology. And in humans, I think Joe Henrich and Francisco Godoy are right about the fact that in humans, prestige matters a lot more. And they emphasize humans' cultural abilities. So where we've, evolved cultural capacities and can produce goods that depend upon knowledge and knowledge that's acquired culturally, individuals that have more of that knowledge are sought after and are accorded deference as a result of their knowledge. Now, I think prestige can be broader than that. There can be a lot of reasons I could benefit you that have nothing to do with my ability to transfer knowledge to you. I just might be more valuable as an ally or a mate, or have some attributes that I might not be able to transfer to you, but yet I could still be a benefit to you. And so I think it's not just humans' cultural capacities, but I think our just general interdependence. We evolved as hunter-gatherers in environments where we depended heavily on each other for cooperation and sharing, and jointly raising offspring. And due to that interdependence, I think there's an explosion of ways in which we could be a benefit to each other, and thus prestige, I think, became much more germane to our hierarchies. And then also, I think we developed more effective mechanisms for squashing dominance-based hierarchy, right? Like our coalitionary abilities are really profound. And so somebody like Christopher Boehm has written a lot about humans, using coalitions to put down would-be dominance, and how that's a key to a lot of human egalitarianism.
And since you just mentioned coalitions and one of the reasons, let's say, humans form them, what are some of the other reasons? I mean, why do humans form coalitions, and how do they choose their allies? What factors play in there?
So I think there's some models of coalition formation that apply to animals and not just humans, that include things like kinship, or other things that could make coalitions likely perhaps more harmonious in terms of shared interests among the coalition members, affecting coalition formation. The relative competitive ability of a potential coalition member can matter. So maybe stronger individuals or individuals that bring more knowledge or whatever, adds more value to the coalition, predicts coalition formation. I think there are also these structural forces that matter. Things like transitive processes, like if I'm in a coalition with you and you're in a coalition with somebody else, it's likely I'll also then develop a coalitionary tie with that third individual, right? And I actually showed that kind of effect recently in a study of Chimane of Bolivia, with Dan Redhead. We looked longitudinally over time at coalition formation and found just such kind of triadic effect. We also interestingly found another kind of structural effect that, an enemy of my enemy, right, is my friend. Things like that. We found some limited evidence for that as well. Those things can matter in coalition formation. But one thing that, where human coalitions maybe are really depart from a lot of other animal hierarchies is just the scale. Like we can form these really big, even community-wide coalitions, based around culturally transmitted, symbolic markers or identities, and that can, and so our coalitions can be massive. Sometimes, millions of people, even in some sense. Uh, so yeah, I don't know if that's answering or what you were driving at with your question, but
Yeah, but I mean, when coalitions are already formed, what sustains them?
um, yeah, I think another thing, yeah, related to that question, I think human hierarchies tend to be more stable because maybe they're marked by these cultural identities. Whereas there's the coalitions and non-humans can be more ephemeral, sort of last while they have instrumental value and then they're gone. Whereas human coalitions can persist even when they don't have immediate instrumental value. They're valuable to us for potential future uses, and so I think that's what humans can anticipate. Maybe future collective action in which coalitions can be useful that helps maintain our coalitions. But I think probably most importantly is that we mark our coalitions with these identities, symbolic identities that we're we're the mighty ducks, or we're the eagles, or we're the whatever. Um, so that's got to, I think probably a primary reason why in humans coalitions can be so stable.
Since you've been mentioning uh, culture, how do you integrate biology and culture when you're studying, for example, as we've been talking about today, leadership and hierarchy? I mean, how do you tease them apart, and then how do you tease apart biological and cultural factors, and then how do you go about integrating them to have a full picture of how hierarchy and leadership works, particularly in human societies?
Yeah, it's a tough question that you know many different ways to approach that. I guess I think maybe on a trivial level, um, cultural inheritance can just expand the kinds of the forms of knowledge and the skill sets that can contribute to status in a given society. Um, so, and also cultural inheritance includes the kinds of norms and institutions that regulate status hierarchy.
Yeah.
So how am I supposed to compete? If I don't compete for status in this way, I'll be sanctioned um, we also inherit venues for status competition, be it sports arenas or religious rituals, right? Or political elections, things that we also inherit that demarcate how we compete for status in a given society. So I think that's all. Maybe that's maybe a more trivial way in which culture interacts with our sort of maybe evolved motivations for status competition. Um, you know, as a behavioral ecologist, I'm interested in how ecology and demography and environment shapes the kinds of cultural norms and institutions we create. So, why are certain human societies more egalitarian that have promote norms of status leveling and humility, right, as opposed to other societies that maybe cultures of honor, for example, where if you're insulted, it's expected that you're going to respond with aggression. I'm interested in not only considering how cultural norms and institutions interact with our sort of maybe evolved motivations, but also why certain cultural norms and institutions emerge in particular places and not others related to status competition.
Yeah, and since you mentioned ecology, where do you place ecology in relation to biology and culture?
I think ecology can mediate the relationship between maybe our evolved psychology and our behavioral and cultural outcomes. Furthermore, the cultural outcomes can shape our ecology and shape our psychology. So there's these complex interactions, but I see ecology as like a mediator. You take a human, you put them in a context like a hunter-gatherer in context where there's heavy dependence on each other for cooperation, sharing food, and minimal recourse to material wealth, smaller group size, I think that's going to tend to produce the kinds of egalitarian ethoses that you see in a lot of hunter-gatherers. And that's my view as a behavioral ecologist, that we can predict to some degree the cultural norms and institutions that humans generate, in part as a product of these mediating effects of ecology or demography. So I think, for example, group size matters as well.
In that case, group size would also be an ecological factor, or is that more of a like social factor? Or I mean, are social factors also fall under the rubric of ecology?
Yeah, I mean, ecology matters. It has effects on demography, right? And then demography affects ecology, so they're linked. But you know, over human evolutionary history, living in environments with greater food abundance, more predictable food sources, could have effects on increasing group size and group density. Certainly, the agricultural revolution affected group size and group density. That and access to material wealth, which in turn can affect the nature of our status hierarchies. So, yeah, I think these things like ecology, demography, cultural norms and institutions can have these very complex interactions, and human psychology as well. But yeah, I don't know. Does that? Maybe I'm not hitting the question.
Yeah, no, my question was more, okay, so let me try to be more specific. When you talk about ecology, does sociality also fall under its rubric? I mean, for example, social factors like demography, is that also ecology, or is it a separate thing?
I mean, you can look at it independently of ecology. So if you can treat ecology as the sort of environmental affordances, resource access, the concentration of resources, how the ecology affects movement of people, and those things are going to have impacts on demography, the size, the density of human settlement, the reproductive rates of humans, and then they can feed back on each other. So they're intricately linked. But I think, yeah, you can separate them if you look just at ecology as sort of environmental affordances, perhaps. But they will affect each other, and demographic processes might prompt cultural change or innovation that then leads to new forms of technology and production that then reshapes our ecology. So yeah, they're sort of independent, but you can also see them as sort of these overlapping, even nested kind of processes.
And since we've been talking about hierarchy, do we know what are the ecological factors that influence how hierarchies are structured in human societies? Like, for example, do we know what are the ecological factors that cause? I'm not sure if causing is the correct term to use here, but cause hierarchies to be more or less coercive, for example.
Yeah. Mentioned hunter-gatherers and egalitarianism, and there's a lot of work on trying to understand why humans can be so egalitarian. And in terms of the ecology, yeah, the risk of producing food on a given day, and how that motivates cooperation across individuals, and can lead to cultural norms that promote sharing and humility as a means of maintaining those sort of sharing networks. all you could point to as a consequence an ecology that really promotes cooperation. Um, Egalitarianism, there can be other inputs to egalitarianism, like the ability of people to vote with their feet. If they don't like something, that's happening in their current group, their ability to migrate to another group. And our human sort of kin networks can play a large role there. Humans, we define kinship not just consanguinely, but also affinally through marriage. That opens up a broader network for us of opportunities for establishing relationships, or as sources of aid when we in times of need. Weapons might also have played a role in human egalitarianism, in sort of leveling contest abilities across individuals. And some of my, another huge thing is our coalitionary abilities, right? Our ability to limit dominance-based sort of status via coalitions. And then also, some of my work with the shamane has shown, interestingly, that these sort of social network effects can matter too. And then in smaller groups where individuals are interacting with most other individuals, you can get diffusion of status across individuals through people's interactions. And so I've shown in the Chamane people of Bolivia over time that who you're connected to affects your subsequent status. And critically also that individuals aren't preferring to interact only with other individuals of a similar status. And so without that kind of status homophily, you can get broad diffusion of status across a community. So then, related to the other part of your question, what can shift things to more inequality, ecologically, demographically? Once, when there are environments where the resources become more especially defensible, that can be especially potentially greater inequality. We see that in non-humans too. So, for example, there you compare female chimpanzees and female gorillas, for example. And female chimpanzees experience more contest competition over these over fruit resources, whereas the female mountain gorillas their vegetative sort of diet is more evenly distributed and abundant, and they experience less competition over that. And so you can get then the hierarchies of female gorillas are more shallow and less linear, and the hierarchies of female chimpanzees are more linear and steeper. So the defensibility of resources can matter. And so in humans, there are even hunter-gatherers, right, where when resources become more defensible, you see steeper hierarchies, even inherited political statuses, more warfare, even slavery. So defensibility of resources is key. Also, generally the extent to which subordinates have leverage, right? So there's a whole class of models in animal behavior and ecology, reproductive skew models, that look at what causes individuals to accept lower rates of reproduction relative to more dominant individuals, and the extent to which subordinates have more leverage over dominance than that difference between the more dominant and less dominant individuals in terms of their reproduction is lessened. So things like having outside options, being able to migrate outside the group, can give subordinates leverage. The extent to which producing things depends on cooperation can give subordinates leverage in humans and in non-humans. I think the key factors in thinking about how ecology can shape the extent of status inequality, humans or non-humans, is defensibility of resources and the extent of subordinate leverage over higher-ranking individuals. Um, and then maybe one other thing, especially particular to humans, coming back to our discussion of leadership,
Yeah.
as human group sizes increase, get larger and denser, um, again, often according to the ecology, that can create all kinds of problems. So coordination problems, free rider problems, disputes that can create demand for leader-follower relationships, right? And so increases in inequality could be in part, not just result of ability of those that have more access to resources and can defend them, coercing others, but also there can be some mutual benefit to hierarchy in terms of leader-follower relationships, helping resolve these problems of group life. And so we see, in hunter-gatherers, for example, there are examples of seasonal cycling between more and less egalitarian kinds of political arrangements, given the sort of group size, demand for coordination, things like that.
So another specific thing that you study is or follower-leader relationships. What emotions underpin these kind of relationships?
I think leadership and maybe status more generally. There's been a lot of work on social emotions like envy and pride, regulating pursuit and management of our status relative to others. I think those are, key in motivating our pursuit of, reputations, social reputations generally, but also certainly in terms of our status relative to others, in terms of access to resources, our pursuit of leadership positions, so yeah, I think those things matter. I think, I don't know whether this counts as emotions per se, but critical to leader-follower relationships are the sense among followers that their interests are being served. So this sort of maybe related to sort of cheater detection, really, that followers are especially sensitive to when leaders are not taking their interests into account or not involving them in decision-making processes in any way. And so leader legitimacy matters a lot. And so that's critical for effective leadership. And I think group members are constantly sort of on the lookout for cues in their leaders of lack of commitment to group goals or to followers. And that as a sort of, an aspect of sort of, if you will, cheater detection. So, and the emotions that provokes in terms of maybe anger can matter a lot in regulating leader-follower relationships.
But do you think that any of these emotions has evolved specifically to deal with leader-follower relationships? I mean, are these adaptations to deal with that kind of problems, let's say?
I don't know. I maybe wouldn't say that per se, but maybe the emotions that get recruited in the context of our leader-follower relationships are, borrowed from other contexts, or but whether, there are kinds of emotions that evolve specifically to help regulate or manage leader-follower relationships, I wouldn't say as such, or have any evidence of.
So there's one question about leadership I haven't asked you yet. Does leadership differ significantly between, let's say, small-scale, relatively egalitarian societies and large-scale, more unequal societies?
Yeah. So in more, egalitarian societies, I think, status distinctions generally are more subtle. Political leadership exists, but doesn't involve coercive authority, but rather it's very focused on persuasion, articulation of consensus, and involves conflict mediation, particularly for conflicts that aren't resolved by the parties directly involved. Leaders, will occasionally act as mediators. But leaders don't tend to sort of necessarily obviously differentially benefit, at least directly. I have evidence that there are reproductive benefits to status, including leadership in small-scale human societies. But it might be for these more indirect, effects of positive reputations on access to mates and allies who assist you in times of need. I've shown with the Chamane, with whom I work in Bolivia, that leaders of collective food production, for example, don't get more than others. In fact, might tend to get less often. So those are some key, maybe general descriptors of leadership in more egalitarian societies. That it's non-coercive, articulating of consensus, involved in mediation, involved in coordination, but not necessarily gaining more direct benefits. When leadership becomes more institutionalized in societies that are, wealthier, larger scale, leadership, is often afforded more rights, maybe even rights to polygyny or food taboo, exclusion from food taboos, other things. They might have arbitration abilities even in deciding outcomes. They also often have more responsibility, so leaders might be more expected to engage in noblesse oblige, or share sort of with group members. So leaders often serve in chiefs or chiefdoms and societies with more formalized leadership engage in redistribution. Leadership's, when it's involved in formal institutionalized sort of justice, justice tends to be more restorative rather than punitive. So leaders are often, when they're arbitrating, may look to not punish per se, but restore, victims to their prior, wealth levels, or or compensate kin of victims. So contrast that with state-level societies of the kind we're familiar with, or historically, where there was much more, even more coercive leadership. Certainly non-democratic forms of leadership, monarchies and sultanates and emperors and all that. Leadership can be highly coercive. Leaders might be much more punitive rather than restorative. Also, I think the larger scale the society, the more opportunity there is for status generally to exacerbate relative to our interindividual differences. So, like, the leader of might have way more access to wealth and power than the next person, but their individual attributes don't justify that in any way. And so, why that exacerbation of effects of status relative to the actual costs and benefits that we could actually as individuals oppose on each other, it gets exacerbated by the institutions that accord us more rights and or powers as individuals, and also the way just that prestige can beget prestige. Where in societies more complex divisions of labor, more ways of learning how to do things and make things, and it becomes less clear, how to become prestigious. Then individuals may tend to just grant prestige to those other individuals already grant prestige, as a means of because of lack of understanding of how did that person get to be prestigious? Well, I'm going to rely on others and their judgments of who deserves prestige. And also then those who already have prestige can normalize what means to be prestigious and what it means, how to access leadership. You have to have the right skin color, or be born to the right person, or be the right religion, and so all these processes by which status differences can be exacerbated relative to our individual attributes. All that can be much more profound in larger scale societies. Um, so yeah, it's
Yeah. So another question then: is leadership in human societies, or does it tend to be male-centered? I mean, are there particularly in more small-scale societies that perhaps are the ones closest to the ones we've evolved in? Are there also female leaders? I mean, and are human societies fundamentally patriarchal or not?
uh, yeah, I think certainly in smaller scale societies, there uh, prior to some more recent increases in women's representation in leadership, I think you're probably most likely to find female leadership in smaller scale, more egalitarian societies, and also societies that practice matrilineal descent, where you trace descent and pass wealth through the female line. I think
Yeah.
there's evidence that women are more likely to have held leadership positions and including formal leadership positions in more matrilineal societies. So in matrilineal societies, there's more evidence that women have held formal leadership positions. And certainly at the household level in matrilineal societies, women have extensive, tremendous influence over economic and other decision making. And then at the sort of our community level in matrilineal societies, women tend to have more formal leadership positions. And but that said, what I call any of these societies matriarchy is not necessarily. If you define matriarchy as societies where women tend to have more power or influence or access to resources relative to men, no. But I wouldn't call them patriarchies either necessarily. A lot of more small-scale egalitarian societies are matrilineal societies with a lot of women, female-based leadership. So yeah, it's not as clear cut. Now, I'd say probably the majority of human societies, especially more recently, are clearly patriarchal. A lot of more small-scale egalitarian societies, not necessarily so, but they're not necessarily matriarchal either. And also, making things more complex, my sort of reading of the literature of more egalitarian, small-scale societies, hunter-gatherers, horticulturalists, is that does seem, on average, men tend to play a more prominent role in organizing, community-wide meetings. On the other domains where, not that women don't do that, but just maybe on average, you see this difference. On the other hand, women can be as active or more active than men in dispute resolution, and especially sort of calling out non-normative behavior. So drawing community attention to sort of norm violations. Yeah, I think women play, the women play a prominent role in leadership in a lot of smaller scale, more egalitarian societies, and in matrilineal societies where wealth tends to be passed down the female line. There's certainly clear evidence of more women in positions of power and leadership, but matriarchy, not clearly. No. Interestingly, I've done some work with the Chamane where they're fairly egalitarian, but there's clear gender difference in access to political influence, at least overt political influence, in the context of community meetings.
Yeah.
And I was interested in understanding that difference. And with some colleagues, Sarah Lamy and others showed that the same traits that predict access to political leadership and influence in men also predict it in women. Things like body size, knowledge, and especially social connections in the community. Why then women tend to have less formal, or not formal, but less informal political influence relative to men in the Chamane is because they tend to score lower on those attributes. And why? Well, especially in the case of access to especially new kinds of knowledge, market-based knowledge, and then building broad-based social connections, especially with non-kin. A lot of those things are are limited to women because of this gender division of labor, where women are expected and do perform much more of labor inside the home, men spend more time outside the home, right? I think that's cross-cultural, ubiquitous, this gender division of labor, although it can take different forms and it'd be more pronounced or less pronounced. And I think that's really key to understanding patriarchy, especially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess that you've already touched on this a little bit, but my last question will be, so are there any, at least on average, sex differences in how men and women approach leadership?
Yeah, it's a landmine of a question. And I've, I think, I think there are gender differences in traits and behaviors that affect leader emergence or leader effectiveness, right? I don't think they're purely, things like risk seeking or competitiveness or large scale coalition building, or mind reading, ability to sort of understand a crowd, things like that might show gender differences in different directions that I don't think are purely cultural constructions. On the other hand, I think why those gender differences exist is more of a complex interaction between evolved psychology, related to sexual selection, and how that interacts with ecology, local environment, and culturally transmitted norms and institutions. I think there's this complex, relationship there. First, let's take, for example, like competitiveness. There's a lot of like experimental economics work that shows men tend to be more competitive in these paper and pencil tasks than women. Clearly, there are certain forms of competition. Men are definitely more competitive cross-culturally in terms of use of willingness to use violence to achieve aims. More like competitiveness generally tends to have a much smaller gender difference, as illustrated by these paper and pencil kinds of experimental tasks. That said, there's examples in more in some matrilineal societies that gender difference goes away in competitiveness. And there are also certain contexts that can get rid of that gender difference. So Alessandro Casar, economist, has shown that when women are competing for the benefit of their children, or individuals are competing for the benefit of their children, that gender difference in competitiveness goes away. When relative earnings are hidden, where people can't see each other's relative earnings, that gender difference in competitiveness goes away. So there are contexts that can shape and push that gender difference around, right? Something else that interests me a lot is coalition building, right? And some would argue men tend to form larger coalitions based on rigid hierarchies that are more instrumental, and women tend to form coalitions that have shallower hierarchies that are based more on strong relationship sort of building rather than more instrumental. But again, there's some evidence for that kind of distinction. Men more likely to form weak ties, women less so in organizations. But again, how much of that is based around things like gender division of labor and the cultural norms and institutions that affect opportunity to broadly social network, and then also expectations of and norms that those gender divisions of labor create that place expectations on men and women's behavior. And I think so. There's these complex interactions between, perhaps an evolved gender differences in psychology related to sexual selection, and the kind of cultural norms and institutions. And I think, we still have so much to learn about those kinds of interactions.
Yeah, fair enough. So just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet?
Yeah, thanks. You can Google Chris von Rueden. My website, I have my publications and descriptions of my work up there. It's a Google Sites website. So just Google me, you'll find it, Chris von Rueden. I also have up on there some of my other affiliations. I'd like to actually plug something called the One Pencil Project. Mm-hmm. It's an NGO that myself and some other anthropologists run, all volunteer-based, where we support education in educational opportunities in some of the indigenous societies where we work. Mm-hmm. So you can find information about that there as well on my website. But yeah, and also feel free to reach out to me. You can email me at my University of Richmond account, which also you can find on my website.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Hey, thanks so much. This has been awesome.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, hit the subscription button, all of those things you already know. And please consider supporting the show either on PayPal or Patreon. All of the links will be in the description box of the interview, starting at $1 per month, so it would be a great help. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litske and Blanchett, Pererga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vosbo, Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windager, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bulut, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy and Trader in NYC. My producers Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luis Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.